Hello, it is working.
All right, so the first things first, I want to just remind everybody about a wonderful talk tomorrow night. So Debbie Sandler is going to be speaking about times of introspection and renewal, and Debbie invites you to share her personal story of tikkun and health, her own aha shofar moment.
You left out one thing, it's a women's.
It's a women's only talk, so that excludes me, I'm afraid.
Sorry.
Okay, so first off, thank you for everyone for coming. I must admit this is a turnout much bigger than I was anticipating. I wasn't expecting so many people to arrive, so it's a little bit daunting. And I'm really so who am I? So my name is Jake Shepherd. This is very hard. Who am I? My name is Jake Shepherd, originally from South Africa, hence the funny accent, just like your rabbi. And I just want to thank everybody for just opening your arms and inviting my wife and I in. It's really been an amazing, warm welcome. Now, when Rabbi Katz first asked me when I arrived, how's it going in terms of my settling into Netanya, I immediately responded, living the dream. I meant it and I mean it. But it's not just my dream. It's my parents' and my grandparents' dream as well. In many respects, we are living their dreams as well. And it's really an aspirational path that we've all wanted to aspire towards. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight to listen to my first talk at the McDonald Shul. And that reminds me of an old joke of the new rabbi getting up and giving his first sermon at his new shul. And he stands up, gives the sermon, and afterwards the president goes up to him and thanks him for giving 2 speeches. The rabbi said, "What do you mean 2 speeches? I just gave 1. He said, "No, you gave 2. He said, "How's that? It was your first speech and it's your last speech." So I'm hoping I'm only giving 1 talk tonight. So we've just come through Rosh Hashanah, all right? Interesting times. And we're leading up into Yom Kippur, and that's, it's got its beautiful and meaningful davening. The tone of the day is serious, and it's really amazing, the nigunim and tunes. It's a very serious day. And really what we're called on to do is to do vidui, to confess our sins, etc. And we are told that the day itself atones for us. It's really the uniqueness of the day that gives us atonement. My question to this is, really? Does that really make sense? Personally, I don't buy it. I really don't. All we have to do is clap our chest and say, we confess, we sinned, and then all of a sudden, voila, we get atonement. It doesn't really make sense. It's not Jewish, actually. When has Judaism ever been something that's easy? And this seems too easy. So I also know that New Year's resolutions don't particularly work out that well. I don't know if you know the recidivism rates of diets, but 95% of people who start a diet end up weighing as much, if not more, a year later. So we know that New Year's resolutions aren't that particularly effective, and I know that I'm tired every Yom Kippur coming up and making promises that I know that I'm going to try and remake those promises and not having lived up to them from the previous Yom Kippur. So what is the goal of Yom Kippur then, in that case? Surely we take an entire day off, we're investing time, investing energy for some return, and hopefully that return is lasting change. But how do we achieve that? And that's really the topic of my talk tonight. So for starters, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I think the Rambam's got that covered. The Rambam tells us you recognize and discontinue improper actions, you verbally confess to the actions, you regret the actions, and you determine and you basically say, I'm never going to repeat that action again. It's good advice, it really is. But it presumes a few things. One, that you know what you're doing wrong. And the other problem that I have with it really just focuses on our faults. What are we doing wrong? So if you just focus on your faults, and I think it's a little bit like trying to treat, when you put a plaster on a wound and you think, well, I'm treating the symptoms, that's good, but it's a deep wound and it really needs antibiotics. You're not really getting down to the cause of the thing. So my question to you is, why is change so hard? Why is it so difficult to achieve meaningful and lasting change? My father is a retired optometrist, and he told me about a story of a tribal black man that came in to get his eyes tested. And he said, my glasses are running out of muti. Muti is the African word for medicine. Please put some more muti into my glasses so I can see again. And we all get the humor, right? The humor is that glasses correct vision. It doesn't really help to throw medicine into the glasses to correct your vision. But isn't that us today? When we go to shul, we see our rituals that we do. It's almost as if we expect our rituals to be in some way magical, to have some sort of a magical power imbued in them, and that will work, but we don't really know why. Don't really connect with them. And I'm sure most of us wish that our rituals were a little bit more effective than they are. And that is something that we can almost think of our rituals having run out of muti, and we'd really like to add a bit more into them. So for change really to be long lasting, there has to be a fundamental shift in perspective. I think that's the core message of what I'm trying to give it to you tonight, is we have to create a shift in perspective. We need to change fundamentally how we go about seeing the world and our role in it and how we perceive it. And if we achieve that, we can achieve lasting inner change. So for me, the real problem is that we might have lost direction in life. We might have not actually tapped into what our real purpose is in life, and that's maybe for me is the real problem. So I want to talk about tonight is how do we achieve this fundamental shift? How do we see the world from a different perspective, and how does that ultimately change everything forever? So I've come to realize that the best advice is not telling people what to do. The Rambam has that covered. It's not for me to do that. But I really want to try and provide a reframe, a different way of seeing the world. So the perspective I'm going to be talking about tonight is not new. In fact, it's positively ancient. However, just as the glasses that we wear, we see the world through our glasses. Our lenses shape the world that we see around us. We don't really see the glasses themselves. I want to posit that a lot of what I'm talking about tonight is so ancient and so embedded in our culture that we don't see it and we don't appreciate it for what it is. And so my challenge to all of you tonight is to take off your glasses and we're going to actually have a look at them and see what it is that is really behind a lot of what we do. So Jews introduced to the world the concept that we're called on to be co-creators of the world alongside God. And this carries with it an awesome responsibility. For some, like Jonah, it was a lot easier to abscond and turn away from that responsibility. But I think for most of us, we've just actually forgotten the calling that we had. And I want to suggest that change comes from seeing ourselves in a new light. And when we fully appreciate the greatness within us and we commit to embracing a godly path, then we can tap into infinite potential. So this change in perspective leads to real and profound change. And at the end of the talk, I want to understand the role of ritual and how that ultimately can support us in our change journey. So it's actually very hard. Let's look at the concept of time. It's very hard for us to understand a time before the Jews arrived on the scene. How did the world see time? How was time perceived? So in the past, we had always thought of time as these, when I'm saying we, I'm talking about the ancient world, it always seen time as this never-ending cycle. It always renews, always comes back to the beginning. It's almost as if new energy is put in on each cycle, and really what we're trying to do is we're trying to tap into that energy that is coming through from these cycles in time. If you think of Stonehenge, I've never visited, but it's really there to tap in or work out when the summer and winter solstices are. Why? Because then you can perform the rituals to tap into the raw energy that's actually embedded in time. So Judaism did something unique. It introduced to the world the whole concept of time as a narrative. Time really has a flow. There's a beginning, there's these twists and turns and bends, and then there's this end to it. And this is something that Judaism introduced to the world that didn't exist before us. If you think about Eastern religions still have this old view of time. They see this time as a never-ending cycle, and they talk about reincarnation, but not as us Westerners think of something that's actually, that's exciting, we can come back, right? They see it as a punishment. We are trapped in this never-ending cycle, and we actually want to be released. That's what Nirvana is all about. We want to be released from this never-ending cycle. We want to transcend. So that's a very old way of seeing the world. And Judaism introduced this new radical way of seeing the world. And we have to see, when you actually see that, you start realizing that we are all part of this chain. We're all part of this chain going back to Avraham Avinu, going all the way through all of our generations. Each of our generations is a link, all the way through to our descendants, that we're handing over the responsibility of this, of continuing on this chain. And we really see time as a river. You can almost think of it in terms of a metaphor. It's got a source in the beginning. It's got all these bends and turns as it goes through the land, and that's these generations actually continuing the process on. And it's got an end. It's got a place where it goes out to the sea. In this sense, time has an end, i.e. there's a place at the sea that ends, but it also a means to an end. The whole concept of end as being purpose. Time's got a purpose. And that is something that Judaism introduced to the world. And we're called on not to be spectators standing on the riverbanks. We're actually called to dive in and actually be part of the river and have that experience of being pulled along by the river, have that change us. And that's a unique introduction, it's a unique understanding of time that Judaism introduced to the world. It didn't exist before. And actually, if you think about the whole concept of progress, it's embedded in that things go forward, things are improving all the time. It's a uniquely Jewish invention that was introduced to the world. So, Rabbi Katz we gave a very nice talk on Shabbat, and he was talking about Yom HaZikaron, talking about remembrance, Rosh Hashanah being remembrance, and he talked about the fact if you resurrect Rabbi Akiva, and he'd have so much in common with all of us if he arrived here today. And I suggested to Rabbi Katz, there's actually something further. It's not just a remembrance, not just that he's got so much in common with us from a historical point of view. He's got so much in common with us from a futuristic point of view. His goals and our goals align. What Rabbi Akiva would want is what we would want. He'd be interested in things like, a Jewish self-determination. How do you do that? He'd be interested in ethics in a modern world, all the challenges of technology. He'd be interested in so many of the things, Jewish ethics and how that's evolving, that we're interested in. And actually that's why. Why? Because we're all part of the same river, part of the same journey. So, our ancestors and us are already swimming in that same river. And this grand narrative of time actually gives us meaning in our lives. We attach ourselves to something that is far greater than our own personal project. We are part of a greater project, the project of Klal Yisrael, one of perfecting the world in Tikkun Olam. So really talking about this Jewish path, and I've then got two questions. Well, how do we go about finding this path? It's very nice we've got this godly path, but how do we find it? And secondly, well, how do we know we're staying on it once we've found it? And that's really what my talk's about tonight. So in terms of finding the path, I'm going to be talking about following a Torah-inspired lifestyle and then appreciating the role of our inner conscience in defining how we should actually live. We have an old invitation in Parshat Re'eh. Re'eh anochi noten lifneichem hayom bracha u'kala. See, this day I've set before you a blessing and a curse. So you're invited to choose a blessing and to turn away from the curse. So think in this sense of choosing a path. We are asked to, it's not a single choice. Every day you have to choose, that's the path I'm going to be on. It's a continuous choice, and we're confronted with that choice every day. And I want to remind us that it is far more useful to think of walking a path than it is to think in terms of rewards and punishments for specific behaviors. I don't think that's a particularly useful framing. So think in terms of walking a path. I think God has created a majestic world that is perfect in all respects, including creating a world where the path that we're on actually holds blessing, or we stumble upon curses. And really what those things are things that are guideposts. They're telling us, yes, we're on the right path, or no, we're actually on the wrong path at all. So something that I also want to discuss is, why is it that we often why do we lose direction in life? That's also for me is another, and why is it that, I'm saying one way of doing it is to say, you've got this Torah invitation to choose a blessing and to turn away from a curse, and actually that means do the mitzvot, live a Torah lifestyle. But why is it that we can't do what modern people do, which is to dismiss that and say, well, that's all old stuff, right? We can go about our inner choices. We can decide what's good for us and what's not. And that's like modern society of today. And they dismiss religion altogether. And they really base their decision on what feels right. What is it, if you actually speak to a modern person, certainly if you're looking online, they'll tell you, oh, that feels wrong. Therefore, we're protesting against it. And so one question I want to ask, well, what's wrong with our inner compass? Surely our inner compass is probably a good way of determining what's wrong and right. So I don't know if you've heard of a fantastic bloke by the name of Jean Piaget. So Jean Piaget is a Swiss psychologist. We're talking about 1890s to 1980, and he's known for his work on child development. And I've recently heard a very interesting insight of his, and that is that if you think about ethical decision making, we are trying to make a decision that is good for me. It's not only good for me, but it's good for my family. It's not just good for my family, but it's actually good for my community. And maybe it's good for my city and my country and the world. That's one set of dimensions. But there's a whole new set of dimensions, which is dimensions in time. All of those dimensions, I need to make sure the decision's good for now. It's good tomorrow. It's good next week. It's good 100 years from now, if not 1,000 years from now. So you can start thinking of all of these dimensions across which we try to optimize our decision making. It's a very difficult puzzle. So if you are faced with countless decisions every day, imagine trying to optimize across all of those dimensions. What halakha is, halakha gives us a rule of thumb, gives us a way of actually a framework that we can make decisions that are optimized across all of those. The modern way of thinking, which is I'm going to use my inner feelings to guide my decision making, that's really trying to optimize decisions for me today. And it's actually forgotten about all the other dimensions, whether this decision that I'm making is good, next week, next year, or is it actually good for society? Is it good for my nation? Those sort of dimensions just fall away. And the Torah way of life actually says, no, Torah framework, that making decisions within that actually brings in all of these dimensions. So I think it's actually important to actually take that view. And I suppose what I'm asking really for is that when you hear about a halakha, a law that you don't really understand, and it seems that doesn't sound fair, maybe just approach it with a bit of humility and say, well, maybe I don't understand it because I don't understand all the dimensions that are taken into account, but actually I hope one day to be able to tap into the wisdom of what it is it's trying to teach me. The other aspect of a godly path, so one aspect is Torah, but another aspect of godly path is something else. And really what that is, in the past, if you think about it, we had prophets. We had these amazing people who would tell us, how we're going, how well we're doing, on the right path, on the wrong path. And that's what we have. So I've brought a very short pasuk from Mishlei, King Solomon's wisdom. Ba'ein chazon yipara, am shomer Torah ashrei. So for the lack of vision, a people lose restraint, but happy is he who heeds instruction. Okay, so what does that mean? Rashi tells us that the chazon, that without vision, the people become unrestrained. When Israel causes prophecy to withdraw from them by mocking the prophets, they will become unrestrained and will degenerate. So Rashi is clear that chazon in this case refers to prophecy. So it's the lack of a particular type of vision that leads to an unrestrained type of behavior. Now, our modern day image of prophets is as seers, those people who stare into the future, into a crystal ball, and know what's going to happen. That's not what our prophets were. A better model to understand what our prophets were is that of a marriage counselor. A marriage counselor tries to reconcile the relationships between husband and wife. Well, the husband in this case is God and the wife is Israel. So our prophets really play that role of counselor, trying to ensure that we've got the right relationship with God, telling us we're going off on the wrong track. This is what we need to do to repair that relationship and get it back to an even keel. So, yes, we can tap into the Torah, we still have that, but we've lost our prophets. I want to say to us that we don't have our prophets, so we don't have a clear message from them as to what we need to do, but we have something else. We still have vision, and that vision is an inner vision. It's listening to an inner voice. It might not be as clear, but it's still something and not to be ignored. So a little bit of a backstory about me. So, as I said, come from Johannesburg, grew up in a small town, fell in love with software. So in the early 1980s, so this is actually, when I grew up in the early 1980s, the first home computers came out. So I was around about, I think I just got into high school, so now you can sort of know how old I am or how young I am. And I begged my parents to please buy me one of these home computers because I wanted to teach myself to code. And I really fell in love. I spent every single day in front of this computer teaching myself to code. So I'm one of those self-taught programmers when nobody around knew what coding was all about. So fast forward to 2017. So, I'm this owner-managed company, and this company gets acquired. And it's, up until then, I had, like always, software was my thing. I'd been getting to grips with people. People were actually quite challenging for me. It wasn't something that I'd focused on. But I needed to, for business purposes, to understand people a little bit better. So I've done some reading about it and some progress and some growth in that sphere. But my primary goal was still very much coding. And when this acquisition occurred, something happened. I went into a funk. Maybe it wasn't depression. It might have felt that way at the time, but nothing fulfilled me. My coding didn't fulfill me anymore. I really didn't get the energy that I used to get from it. And I actually was lost. I didn't know what on earth had hit me. Very lucky to have a wife and a daughter who are super perceptive. And they talked me through this. They said to me, Jake, you know what? You know when your eyes sparkle? Is when you're sitting with another human being, helping them to grow professionally and personally. That's what actually seems to energize you these days. And it was an amazing insight that I took to heart. My entire life I built up skills on how to write software, and all of a sudden I was confronted by something that actually fed me, that gave me energy, which was something I was totally and utterly unskilled for. It was quite a big turning point in my life that I had to embrace. So I didn't really have a choice. I needed to feel better, and I wasn't feeling better by coding. So what I had to do is I made a conscious decision. I'm going to be a people person. If anybody knows any software geeks, you know that that's not the easiest decision in the world. So I made that decision. It's not that I became a people person overnight, I certainly didn't. But I basically made a decision. I then slow things happened. I started watching different videos on psychology and on philosophy. I started watching leadership and reading leadership books, how to grow people, how to inspire people. And that's the journey I started on. I can tell you I would never ever, my previous persona, have stood up in front of a crowd and given a shiur. But this is actually the journey I went on. And my wife saw small changes, because the truth is it wasn't a big change. But my children at that stage were already in Israel. So this is happening over the last 6 years, right? My children are in Israel for the last 6 years. So they would come home occasionally. And for them, it was like one of these, in South Africa we used to have lucky packets with a mystery toy in it. And you didn't know what the mystery toy was going to be. That was their father for them. They had no idea what was going to happen the next time they visited home. And that was the step change that occurred. So, you know, for me, the first part of that change was very, very small. It was a decision. But everything else after that, if I look back, are massive changes. There really are massive changes. And I think one of the most astounding insights of the Torah is that we are all created in the image of God. We all have the spark of the divine in us. And actually, that spark of the divine is that inner voice of ours. It's that inner voice of conscience. That actually, it might not speak to us with a lot of clarity. It's not a prophet. So you don't hear words, but you do hear feelings. And it tells you you've got to fix something in your life. You're going in the wrong direction. And listening to those feelings can create a profound difference. And it did for me. Just tapping into who I am internally and actually listening. I want to introduce you to the rationalist's perspective. And you know, Judaism has a number of perspectives. One of the contrasting perspectives is rationalism versus mysticism. So one of my good friends, Rosh, he wrote a book recently called Rationalism, and I heard Jeff talk about Rav Nathan Slifkin. I don't know if I was on his tour where the lion attacked him, but maybe just the leopard. So he's got this wonderful book called Rationalism versus Mysticism, and it's not so much that it's a binary decision, one or the other. It's really I suppose it's a bit of it's where you put your emphasis. Do you put your emphasis on the rationalist approach, or do you put your emphasis on the mystical approach? The Rambam is the quintessential rationalist. He viewed everything rationally. So, one area of understanding the distinction between rationalism and mysticism is nature and the role of miracles within nature. So the mystical approach said God intervenes in nature often, frequently, often. You know, when the devout pray for something, God steps in and makes a change, and the devout get what they asked for. And when bad people do things, imagine Korach and his community, God whips out the good old earthquake and swallows them whole. And that is very much this God being involved in every step of the way is very much a mystical approach. The rationalists take a different approach. And they basically say, no, God created a world that is actually perfect. And built into the fabric of the world and the logic of the world is everything that is required. So God builds in with his infinite wisdom all the aspects of the world. And one way of understanding it, or a beautiful quote that I saw from the Ralbag. I don't know the Ralbag's original work. I saw this in Rav Slifkin's Rationalism versus Mysticism. I'm going to quote it for you. So it's Rav Levi ben Gershon, lived from 1288 to 1344. Apparently better known as Gersonides. I'm sure some of you know. This is new for me. And on his commentary in Genesis 6, he explains that the problem with miracles is that they indicate that God's systems of natural laws is not good enough to achieve what he wants to happen. So this is the quote. So when God wishes to perform miracles, he does so via causes that are most appropriate according to natural laws. This is because the natural order of existence was set by God in the most perfect way possible, and when necessary due to providence, requires a change from this order. It is appropriate that God deviate from it as little as possible. Therefore, God does not perform these miracles except via causes that divert very little from nature. So then how we are meant to explain the whole concept of divine providence then? Are we to say that actually divine providence has a very limited role? And actually, because we don't mess with nature, right? So how does God step in and make things happen? And does that actually minimize divine providence in the world, this rationalist approach? And this is a great question. It's bothered Rav Slifkin himself. He's actually written about it. And he struggles to explain divine providence. So I want to try and examine this whole concept of divine providence from a very interesting perspective. Perspective introduced by Richard Wiseman of luck. I don't know if you've ever heard of luck, but there's a very famous, I think I'll read you his thing now. He's a professor of public understanding of psychology at the University of Hertfordshire in the United Kingdom. Okay, very interesting guy. So in his book, Wiseman studied the principles of good and bad luck, and he published results in a book called The Luck Factor. It's a very interesting book. He showed that both good and bad luck actually result from measurable habits. For example, lucky people, by expecting good luck, put more effort into their endeavors and they see the fruits of their endeavors. Lucky people are outgoing and observant, and therefore they have many more chance encounters that up to their level of luck. They have a lucky encounter with people. In addition, lucky people are more likely to look on the bright side of bad occurrences. So I'll give you some examples. So one case, Wiseman actually gave a newspaper to study subjects, and he said to them, what you have to do is look and count how many photographs are in the newspaper. People studiously paged through the newspaper, counting the photographs, and a minute, 2 minutes later, some people went back just to check. They declared 43. Some people, after 2 seconds, said 43. What had happened? Well, actually on the second page was a big advert that said, stop counting now, there are 43 photographs. And what was very interesting, people who felt lucky tended to see that notification, and people who didn't feel lucky never saw it at all. In another scenario, another experiment, he asked people to meet him at a coffee shop, but he had actually placed a £20 note on the way. And people who felt lucky tended to see the note and pick it up. And those people who didn't feel lucky missed the note altogether. So this is a very interesting insight. So I want to basically explain something to you. I think luck and its opposite, bad luck, are a very particular set of lenses. They see the world as containing undeserved reward or undeserved punishment. That's the perspective of luck. By contrast, when one walks on a godly path, the world contains signposts. A signpost to tell us we're on the path, or a signpost to tell us we're just walking off that path. And that's the lens that we're using. So God has created a world that manifests signposts. And really, these signposts are not erected and dismantled on a continuous basis. That would be the mystical approach, but they're there, they're part of the fabric of reality. However, the only way to see them is to wear the correct set of glasses. Not the glasses of luck, but the glasses of providence, so that you can start to see what's happening along the way. And when you do that, all of a sudden you start seeing the opportunities for personal growth. You start seeing the opportunities to reach out and uplift other people and help them grow. And you start seeing resources that allow you to strengthen yourselves and your community. So I think this is why our sages told us that mitzvah goreret mitzvah. When you do a mitzvah, you're getting onto the right path. And when you're on that path, lo and behold, there are more mitzvahs. But our sages also told us, Avera, Goreret, Avera. So when you actually start walking off that path, there's a minefield of other Averas out there for us to tread on. So when wearing the lenses of providence, we also need to appreciate the role of bad things that happen in our lives. You know, life is tragic. There are a lot of bad things. When this happens, it could just be something, unexpected, unexplained. But maybe it's more healthy to think to yourself, well, maybe it's telling me I'm on the wrong path. Maybe it's one of those signposts that are telling me I need to look out, maybe I need to turn around. And this signpost is telling me I've got to course correct. And this is why humility is so important. Again, humility in terms of understanding Torah, but also humility in terms of understanding the signposts. Humility keeps those lenses of ours clear. We start seeing the signposts. Now on Tisha B'Av, our sages get us to sit down and mourn the destruction of the temple, both temples. And what they're telling us is actually introspect. Where are we at fault? Is there sinat chinam, caused us hatred? Do we not have enough respect for one another? Are we involved in theft? These are all, from a Tisha B'Av perspective, we are told to introspect and see where the Jewish people went wrong and continuously go wrong, and that's why we don't have our third temple. How often have you heard a rabbi say, sitting on the floor, it's those Romans, it's those Babylonians, they need to repent, they put us here. I've never heard that. And what the lesson our rabbis are teaching us is at a national level, we don't blame others. We always look internally for where we could improve. Is the world a problem place? Are there Romans and Babylonians? Yes, there are. But it's not particularly helpful to point a finger and expect that to change. It is very, very helpful to point a finger internally and say, what did we do that made this more likely? What did we do in our lives that put us on this path where what happened to us was more likely to happen? That is a much more healthy way of seeing the world. So I would now like to revisit our original question, is how can the ritual of reciting Vidui, the Shamnu, Bagadnu, Al-Chait Shachatanus, become meaningful? How is it possible that we could create lasting change by tapping into these rituals? So first of all, what is a ritual? It's an interesting question. And I had to look it up in Wikipedia to get a bit more of a precise definition, but it's a series of actions performed according to a prescribed order, which is embedded in a larger symbolic system. So let's just think about Vidui from our perspective. So we go to Shul, we want to reduce anxiety by making us, it's the day of judgment after all, right? We want to reduce anxiety that we're actually doing something. So what we do is we clap ourselves on our chest each time to say, listen, we've sinned, we've got a problem here, right? And that clapping is a type of punishment, which actually, maybe that's a bit of redemption that comes with that. So I'm not saying that the rituals don't have benefit. I think they do have benefit, but I don't know if they have full benefit. So the problem is that ritual often survives the reason that gave birth to it. Ritual, I think, actually is an expression of a very deep idea. So we have these deep and profound ideas, and we have to try and make them tangible, and we introduce ritual as a way of giving us an insight into this profound and deep idea. However, over time, it becomes disconnected from the original reason that gave birth to it. And Judaism calls on us to walk a godly path. We have to take aim and pursue a path that elevates us above the mundane. We need to serve a higher end by attaching ourselves to a mission that is far bigger than any personal mission that we could ever have. Rosh Hashanah is really a time of creating clarity. What does my soul ask of me? That's what we're trying to pursue. What is my unique contribution to the Jewish mission? This is the inner work. It's the soul work, and it requires huge introspection. can I picture a godly path that I am called on to walk? Yom Kippur then is a time when we take stock. What decisions have we made that kept us on track? What decisions have sabotaged us and taken us off this path? Video reminds us that every single decision matters. Every decision either takes us to our personal heaven or to our personal hell. It matters because every decision either moves us along a godly path or takes us off it. So is the subtle difference caused by a disconnected ritual, the separation of vidui from its original purpose, such a big deal? Let's ask. Because I went after saying vidui, I sinned, clearly, that's a problem, so I'm recognizing the problem. I also recognize that that sin has actually done something to my relationship with God, so ritual's got that covered. The only part that's missing is the connection of the ritual to being on or off the path. Is that such a big deal? I want to say it is a big deal. If the whole point of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is to create profound and lasting change, then I want to say it's the biggest of all deals. When we recognize that walking a godly path imbues our life with meaning, it's then the difference between nihilism and majesty. It's the difference between finite, being trapped in time, and transcending and being infinite. It's the difference between despondency and hope. And it's the difference between a life that is nasty, brutal, and short, and one that transcends the world by connecting it to the divine. The result of vidui, when seeing the world through such a lens, is a profound awakening. We must see our lives as meaningful. And once these lenses are in our glasses, they don't run out of muti. And that ultimately is how we change. So I want just to remind all of you that you have infinite potential, an absolute infinite potential. We don't know what we could become, and we don't know the impact that we could have on ourselves, our family, and our community, and even our country. What we have to do to tap into this potential is to make a lot of very good decisions. Every decision matters, and every decision takes us along a godly path. That is how we tap into the infinite potential that is within us. So I want to wish all of us a Shana Tova and a Gemar Tov. And my blessing to all of you is that we gain a clear view of our own, each our own unique godly path, and that the company of friends that accompanies us, we meet each other on that godly path, and it's not so lonely. So Gemar Tov. Thank you. So I'd like to open up for questions if there are any questions, observations, criticisms. Yes.
Firstly, I want to say thank you. It was very interesting. And shout out to everyone. So it's a difficult question I'm going to ask. We live in Israel, and we often say how lucky we are to be here. And I love the shul, and it's so warm, and it's amazing, and we want to be better, right? We're all trying to improve. But every week we come, and I hate saying this because I'm not judging, but I'm asking how we can be better. And I feel we can all be better if it's such a minor, it seems like such a minor thing, but to me it's such a big thing. Every time we come to Kiddush, we have things on plastic. And then I walk on the beach and I see the plastic and I know animals are dying. And if we say we are so good and we are so great and we keep the Torah, how can we walk in how can we say we are imitating Hashem when we do that? Because Hashem would not do that to the earth he created. And we do it knowingly. And I'm not judging the shul, really I'm not.
So,
I know it's difficult.
so Philly, you've given me an answer to this question before. You actually pointed out how much it's a water wastage destroys the environment, and actually, it was just an interesting insight. And actually, I think in terms of when you run the washing machine, how much water that uses, and actually, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not like this choice is perfect versus this choice that this is really, really an evil choice. I think all of these choices are a balance. And I think really what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, all right, so how do we find a godly path? And that for me actually tries to say, well, let's approach the world with humility, which is, I don't really know which is the best way of doing things. So let's investigate. Let's see how catastrophic is the plastic question. You also have to say to yourself, you know, man is, first of all, man and nature are incredibly inventive. If I firmly believe that if nature doesn't produce a plastic-eating bacteria, which it has in the oceans, by the way, there's new bacteria in the oceans which are eating away at plastic waste sitting in the great garbage patch in the Pacific. But I think man can also step in and start creating bacterial life that can actually eat a plastic and solve that problem. So I believe in the infinite potential of man to be able to solve some of the problems that we are confronted with today. So I do think that between nature and man, a lot of what we look at as catastrophizing actually isn't. I do think, however, that it's important not, and this is where I suppose trying to almost take a very calm perspective on the world is not to actually see catastrophe and alarmism as something that is going to tip us over the edge, because that panic actually could be the very thing that tips us over the edge, as opposed to a calm, considered way of viewing the world. So I'm actually against all alarmism. I think all alarmism ultimately actually is quite destructive. And if there's a concept that Scott Adams actually uses, he says every time you have a slow-moving train wreck, so anything that is slow-moving, he says, trust that we'll find a way to avert the train wreck. The only train wrecks we have to worry about are those fast-moving ones. So a meteor hurling towards the Earth, that's a fast-moving train wreck. Maybe we can't solve that one. But anything that's a slow-moving train wreck, trust that we'll sort it out. We'll address the issues over time, and we'll step up and solve it, rather than panicking, because I think the panicking creates more, let's say, issues. I'm not saying that you're panicking, I'm just saying the world tends to panic, and that the panicking is not healthy.
I totally hear you, and I'm not panicking, but I do feel that every animal that dies on the beach, because there's so much plastic on the beach, that in our small way as a community, we could prevent that. And it's also a lesson that we're teaching our children, that we've got this plastic, we don't have to wash dishes. I'm not an alarmist, but it does bother me.
So I do think social awareness, and actually just, I suppose, sensitizing people to the negativity of, let's say, bad habits is a useful way of tikkun olam. And actually it's just trying to actually make us all aware. Therese, yeah.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but Tisha B'Av, we look inwards. We don't blame the Babylonians. How does that? You'll repeat my question.
Yeah, I'll repeat your question.
How does that viewpoint level with the Holocaust?
Okay, that is a brilliant question. So
Wait.
yes.
It's a multi-layered question.
So it's, yeah.
The second piece to that is, if we are looking inwards and living and trying and working towards a godly path, yet loss and negative outcome still results, losing a spouse, losing a child, things that were uncontrollable and out of our ability to have an effect, How do you explain them?
So, okay,
So both- so it's two questions.
so this is one of those profound questions. So Teresa's asking the question, well, very nice Tisha B'Av, we look inward. I can tell you the destruction of the first and second temple, there wasn't a lot that the Jews could do there either. I suppose the infighting didn't help, right? So the destruction of the temple because the Jews were actually fighting each other. And then you're saying, well, how does that square up in terms of the remembrance of the Holocaust? And then also on top of that, well, how about personal tragedy and how does that play into it? So let's just, the interesting thing is that the rabbis at the time, when the state of Israel was trying to work out when to commemorate the Holocaust, that rabbi said, we've got a day, it's called Tisha B'Av. We don't need a separate day. And the government actually overruled the rabbis and said, we do need a separate day. So I want to try and explain the reasoning of the rabbis why they said we didn't need a separate day. And the reasoning was, the problem with creating a separate day for commemorating the Holocaust is it very much introduces into the Jewish psyche the concept of us being victims. And the rabbis were dead against that. They said, actually, we shouldn't have a day that commemorates us being victims. Because what Tisha B'Av did is it always turned it around. Yes, we were victims, but it turned it around and said, all right, where did we go wrong? Because actually the question we have to ask ourselves, what is the healthy response to tragedy? Is the healthy response seeing ourselves, the world victimizes? So this is Edith Eger in her Choice, in the book The Choice. Fantastic book. So she talks about victimization is real. It happens. Victimhood, and it's actually what the world does to us. Whether the world just, from a happenstance point of view, a spouse passing away, or whether it's the Holocaust and Hitler doing good, the deed. But basically, victimization happened. She came through the Holocaust. So the question is, victimhood is something we do to ourselves. We're seeing ourselves as victims. That is never okay. To be victimized, we understand that's what happens, but to see ourselves as victims undermines us, disempowers us. It's actually quite simple to think about how that works. Because if it's somebody else's fault, they have to fix it. If I can find something where I'm not a victim, and I can see, well, what can I do about it? How can I respond? That's an empowering approach. So it's not to say that everything is our fault, but it's to say, well, it doesn't help me to point outward and say where the problems are and who should have been better and who should have acted better. At the end of the day, it doesn't actually help us today. So we always then turn inwards and say, well, how did we make this occur? What did we do? Was there anything that we could improve? Maybe the answer is no, there's nothing we could do. But we look there first. And I think that's the healthiest way of actually living our lives in a world that is characterized often by malevolence.
Can I just make a comment on the earlier question about using the disposables? I was at my daughter's over Rosh Hashanah in Zichron Yaakov, and they have tried very hard not to use disposables when they make the Kiddushim. So they bought a lot of hard plastic stuff that somebody has to wash up after Shabbat. And there are problems there too. Not everybody washes them up so clean. Often my daughter's the one who takes them home very quietly and nobody knows about it. It's not a simple thing. Now, they're also talking about it. We're talking about it. They're talking about it. There's a middle path somewhere, and I think if each person at least does what they can at home, don't use the chat pami, when you go on picnics, take your own things, but when you're talking about a community of Ashul's bigger than Eshul and Zichron, it just becomes, it's not easy. It's not an easy choice. It's not an easy choice.
It's definitely not an easy choice. And I do think it's just living responsibly, taking an ownership of the way your decisions that you make and say, well, how can I make this decision in the best way possible? Yes, Susan?
In Australia, there is no plastic sold in the supermarkets. It's only paper products. No plastic bags in
really have bought into it, and they're very, very conscious of it.
Okay,
It's
good.
great to see.
Yeah.
So maybe that's something that we will work to.
Thanks, Jim.
Okay. Anybody else want to say something? I just want to say thank you very much to Jake. There's this story that Jake told us in the beginning about the president of the shul who said this is your first and last. Then you've made 2 speeches tonight. Well, as the chairman of the shul, Jake, you've made 1 speech tonight, and we look forward to lots more speeches from you as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thanks everybody for coming. I really felt supported.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.